The acoustic anomaly recorded beneath the Egyptian sand, approximately 740 kilometers southeast of Cairo in 1993, carried within it something that conventional geological surveys could not adequately explain. And this particular phenomenon became the foundation upon which an entire underground investigation would be constructed over the following 3 decades. Dr. Heinrich Müller, a German geophysicist working under a joint expedition funded by the University of Hamburg and a private archaeological collective known as the Atlantis Foundation, was the first scientist to document this phenomenon with modern seismic equipment, and his initial report, filed on March 15 in 1993, described a pattern of regular, almost rhythmic electromagnetic pulses emanating from a depth of approximately 283 meters below the surface. Pulses that registered at frequencies completely inconsistent with any known natural geological process, yet remarkably consistent with man-made structures of considerable technological sophistication. What made Müller's findings particularly remarkable was not merely the existence of these pulses, but rather their spatial distribution, which suggested the presence of multiple distinct chambers arranged in a geometric pattern across an area spanning roughly 4.7 square kilometers. And this geometric precision stood in sharp contrast to the random, chaotic nature of natural cave systems, fault lines, or underground water reservoirs that one would typically expect to discover in such a location. The seismic readings indicated structural walls composed of materials with acoustic properties unlike anything documented in the Sahara region. Materials that reflected sound waves at angles, suggesting a crystalline composition, possibly a specialized form of silicate or even artificial composite materials. And when Müller presented these findings to the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities on June 3, 1993, the official response was not one of enthusiasm, but rather of immediate concern, followed by administrative obstacles that would persist for more than 2 decades. Between June and December of 1993, 4 separate attempts were made to obtain excavation permits for the site, and each application was denied, with increasingly vague explanations that ranged from concerns about endangered species in the region to supposed risks of sand collapse, despite the area being relatively stable geologically. And on September 28, 1993, an official memorandum was leaked to the German scientific press, indicating that the Egyptian Ministry of Defense had taken control of the site designation, reclassifying the coordinates as a sensitive military zone, a designation that would remain in place continuously for the next 18 years. Müller's attempt to publish his preliminary findings in the Geophysical Research Letters in October of 1993 resulted in a rejection letter that was unusually direct in its language, stating that the material was deemed potentially sensitive to international security concerns and that publication would not be permitted. Language that suggested governmental involvement at levels beyond ordinary academic review processes. During the period from 1994 through 1996, Müller made 7 separate attempts to secure funding for continued research at the site, and each attempt was either withdrawn suddenly or the funding organizations themselves were pressured through various channels to cease their involvement, a pattern so consistent and so obviously coordinated that it became clear to Müller and his colleagues that a deliberate suppression campaign was underway at governmental or international level. The peculiar nature of this suppression was that it was not characterized by outright denial or claims that the site was insignificant, but rather by strategic silence and the creation of administrative barriers that made further research logistically impossible. As if the authorities involved wanted the site to remain secret, not because they were uncertain about its nature, but precisely because they knew exactly what it represented and wished to prevent independent verification or scientific analysis. In 1997, Müller made contact with Dr. Amelia Richardson, an American archaeologist based at Yale University who had spent 15 years researching pre-dynastic Egyptian settlements and possessed connections within academic circles that could potentially circumvent the governmental barriers Müller had encountered, and their collaboration proved fruitful in ways that neither of them anticipated, as Richardson discovered in the archives of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, a series of field notes dating to 1923, written by an expedition led by Professor Walter Emerson, an Egyptologist now largely forgotten in academic circles, but who had, in his unpublished journals, made detailed observations about a sunken structure of geometric precision located approximately 812 kilometers from Cairo, in a direction that matched Mueller's coordinates with remarkable accuracy. Emerson's journals, written in meticulous 19th-century English and preserved in a leather-bound volume that showed obvious signs of age and occasional water damage, contained descriptions of what he termed a pre-dynastic architectural marvel of impossible sophistication. And he had documented encountering, at the site in 1923, a structure that appeared to be constructed from stone blocks of uniform dimensions arranged in patterns that suggested mathematical knowledge far exceeding what was commonly attributed to pre-dynastic peoples. And, most intriguingly, Emerson had noted the presence of what he described as geometric inscriptions of a nature suggesting stellar or celestial observation apparatus, carved into the interior walls of a central chamber he had managed to access before Egyptian authorities had closed the site. The journals indicated that Emerson had conducted detailed measurements of these inscriptions and had proposed, in his 1924 article published in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, that the site represented an astronomical observatory of considerable complexity, a proposal that was met with profound skepticism at the time, and which contributed to Emerson's gradual marginalization within academic circles. And by 1935, Emerson had ceased publishing entirely and spent the remainder of his career in relative obscurity, teaching at a small university in the English Midlands until his death in 1952. What Richardson discovered particularly significant was that Emerson's measurements of the astronomical alignments he had documented matched, with an accuracy of within 0.3%, astronomical calculations for the year approximately 10,840 before Common Era, a date that would place the construction of this underground structure thousands of years before the conventional dating of Egyptian civilization itself. During 1998 and 1999, Richardson and Mueller collaborated on an elaborate research proposal that carefully avoided any mention of their specific coordinates, instead framing the project as a general investigation of geometric ground formations in the North African region. And this proposal was accepted by the National Geographic Society, which provided funding for preliminary surveys across a broader geographic area that would, they hoped, allow them to conduct indirect investigation of their specific site while maintaining the appearance of conventional archaeological research. Their team, which eventually expanded to include Dr. Karim Hassan, an Egyptian geologist from Cairo University, and Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, a Nigerian specialist in ancient African technologies and trade routes, conducted surveys across nearly 18,000 square kilometers throughout 1999 and 2000. And while they obtained fascinating data about numerous geological formations and previously undocumented pre-dynastic settlement patterns, they were unable to obtain direct access to their primary site of interest. Though Mueller's seismic equipment, deployed ostensibly for geological survey purposes, did manage to gather additional data confirming the presence of the underground chambers and suggesting, through sophisticated acoustic analysis, the presence of hollow spaces that appeared to be highly engineered and perhaps intentionally constructed with specific acoustic properties in mind. Acoustic analysis conducted by a specialist team at the University of Southampton in early 2000 revealed that the hollow spaces beneath the sand exhibited acoustic resonance characteristics that appeared to be deliberately engineered, particularly in the low frequency range between 0.5 Hz and 8 Hz, frequencies that correspond to specific brainwave patterns in humans and that are known to induce particular states of consciousness when sustained. A discovery that suggested the structure may have been constructed not merely for storage or habitation purposes, but potentially for specific neurological or consciousness-altering applications. Throughout the early 2000s, attempts to access the site became increasingly difficult. with Egyptian military forces establishing permanent checkpoints at roads leading to the general area in 2001. And on August 19, 2003, Mueller was detained at Cairo International Airport and his research materials were confiscated. And while he was released after 6 hours of questioning with no charges filed, the message was unmistakable that further research attempts at the site would not be tolerated. Richardson, operating from her position at Yale, attempted to coordinate with international archaeological organizations to establish a joint expedition that would have the diplomatic weight to overcome the barriers being erected, and she made contact with UNESCO officials in 2004 to propose the site as a candidate for World Heritage Site status, a designation that would theoretically provide international protection and oversight. But her UNESCO proposal was rejected in an unusually swift manner, with the organization stating that insufficient evidence existed to warrant such designation, a conclusion that contradicted the clear documentary evidence Richardson had assembled and submitted along with her application. Hassan, the Egyptian member of their research team, experienced the most direct pressure, as his position at Cairo University was placed under review in 2005 on grounds that were never clearly specified, and he was ultimately forced to resign in 2006 after receiving what he described to Richardson as quote, _5__, that his continued employment would not be advisable given his involvement with investigations into sites deemed sensitive by the Ministry of Defense. The period from 2006 through 2010 represented a relative lull in direct research efforts, not because of reduced interest, but rather because Richardson and Mueller, having learned the constraints they were operating within, shifted their approach from direct investigation to indirect documentation, and they began traveling through various regional archives and private collections throughout the Mediterranean and Middle East, interviewing descendants of explorers and scientists who had conducted work in the region in previous centuries. And this approach yielded a remarkable collection of anecdotal but consistent accounts of underground structures in the Sahara region. Dr. Raoul Beaumont, a French paleontologist who had conducted expeditions in North Africa in the 1950s and 60s and who had published 2 books about his findings before passing away in 1987, had apparently recorded in his personal journals descriptions of a quote, _6__, that he had accessed during an expedition in 1962, in a location that bore striking similarities to Mueller and Richardson's documented site, and Beaumont had noted in his journals, which Richardson obtained through contact with Beaumont's widow in 2007, that the structure appeared to contain quote, _7__. Additionally, an Italian archaeologist named Dr. Marco Ventinelli, who had conducted limited excavations near the Sahara in 1989, had left behind field notes discovered in the archives of the University of Rome in 2009 that made cryptic references to quote, _8__, and to quote, _9__. And Ventinelli's final published article, which appeared in Archaeologia Italiana in 1991, contained carefully worded language suggesting the author was attempting to convey information while simultaneously avoiding direct statements that might invite official censure or suppression. What emerged from this archival research was a consistent historical pattern spanning approximately 70 years, from Emerson's observations in 1923 through Beaumont's access in 1962 to Ventinelli's work in 1989, in which multiple independent researchers had encountered evidence of sophisticated underground structures in roughly the same geographic region, and each of these researchers had subsequently experienced either suppression of their findings, professional marginalization, or direct official obstruction of further research, a pattern so consistent and so obviously coordinated that it suggested the existence of a deliberate, long-term policy to prevent the world scientific community from obtaining detailed knowledge about whatever lay beneath the sands in this remote region of Egypt. Mueller proposed, in a conference presentation at the International Society of Geophysics in 2011 in Vienna, a hypothesis suggesting that the coordinated nature of the suppression efforts was suggestive of governmental knowledge about the site's true nature and significance, and he implied, though he could not openly state given the constraints he was operating under, that the suppression might not originate solely from Egyptian authorities, but rather from international intelligence agencies operating in coordination with Egyptian government officials. The presentation, which was recorded and which appeared on various internet platforms, generated considerable public interest and resulted in renewed media attention to the site, an outcome that Mueller had anticipated and perhaps partially intended, banking on the theory that public awareness might make continued suppression more difficult or politically costly. During the period from 2011 through 2014, significant changes occurred regarding access to information about the site, as a series of leaked diplomatic cables released by WikiLeaks in 2011 contained references to the site in communications between the United States Embassy in Cairo and the State Department, communications that revealed the United States had maintained an active interest in the location and had been coordinating with Egyptian authorities regarding security protocols at the site. And these cables, while heavily redacted regarding specific details, confirmed that the suppression Mueller and Richardson had documented was not merely a local Egyptian phenomenon, but rather involved coordination with international governmental bodies, most notably the intelligence services of the United States, United Kingdom, and Israel. The cables, dating from 2005 through 2009, made multiple references to asset protection at coordinates 30.06 degrees north, 51.42 degrees east, coordinates that corresponded precisely to the location Mueller had identified, and the cables indicated that this asset required ongoing security maintenance and that scientific inquiry at the location was to be actively discouraged through established protocols. One particularly revealing cable, dated March 17, 2008, and sent from the Deputy Chief of Mission at the American Embassy in Cairo, noted that current protocols have successfully prevented external academic investigation for 15 consecutive years, and current cooperation with Ministry of Defense continues to support asset preservation objectives, language that confirmed not only that the site was known to American intelligence, but that deliberate suppression mechanisms had been in place and coordinated since at least 1993, precisely the year Mueller had conducted his first seismic surveys. The leak of these diplomatic cables transformed the nature of the investigation, as it moved from being primarily an archaeological and geophysical inquiry into being additionally a matter of governmental transparency and international policy. And journalists and investigators began pursuing the question of why governments would invest such resources into suppressing information about an archaeological site. And this shift attracted attention from researchers who approached the question from different angles, including investigative journalists, independent researchers not affiliated with academic institutions, and various media organizations interested in stories about governmental secrecy and conspiracy. In 2012, an investigative journalist named Michael Harrison, working for a British documentary production company, began interviewing former officials from various intelligence agencies regarding the site, and he managed to obtain statements from individuals with backgrounds in governmental intelligence that suggested the site was known by certain governmental bodies to represent something of extraordinary significance. Though these officials, constrained by non-disclosure agreements and concerns about their own legal liability, could not provide specific details about what that significance might be. However, Harrison managed to obtain, through his contacts within intelligence communities, information suggesting that the government interest in the site was not limited to suppression, but included active investigation, and that certain governmental bodies had conducted their own private excavations and examinations of the site. Excavations conducted in secrecy and without international oversight or knowledge. One former CIA operative named Richard Westbrook, who agreed to be interviewed on condition of anonymity, confirmed to Harrison that he was aware of excavation activities at the site in the mid-1990s, activities that he described as highly classified projects involving examination of structures of unknown origin and uncertain age. And Westbrook noted that the materials recovered from the site had been transported to secure facilities for analysis, and that the results of these analyses were beyond the clearance level of anyone not working on the most restricted special access programs. The implications of Westbrook's statements were extraordinary, suggesting not merely that a suppression campaign existed, but that active governmental investigation of the site had been underway for decades, and that whatever had been discovered there was deemed so significant and so potentially paradigm-shifting that it required compartmentalization within the most restricted levels of governmental secrecy. The type of compartmentalization typically reserved for technologies related to nuclear weapons development, extraterrestrial contact, or other matters deemed to threaten national security or the existing international order. Between 2012 and 2015, Harrison released a series of documentary reports about the site, reports that generated significant public interest and which motivated additional researchers to attempt to access information about the location. And while these documentaries did not contain conclusive proof about the site's nature or origin, they did establish public awareness that something potentially significant was being deliberately hidden by governmental authorities, an awareness that created pressure for greater transparency and renewed attempts at investigation. During this period, Mueller, now in his mid-70s and aware that his window of opportunity for direct investigation was diminishing, made one final attempt to access the site through diplomatic channels, proposing a joint Egyptian-German research initiative that would be conducted under the auspices of UNESCO and which would be transparent and open to international oversight. And while this proposal initially received some diplomatic interest, it was ultimately rejected in 2015 when Egyptian authorities informed the German government that the location was permanently designated as a military zone and that no civilian scientific research would be permitted. The acoustic properties of the underground structure, as documented through the seismic surveys conducted throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, revealed something that challenged conventional understanding of what ancient peoples were supposedly capable of engineering, particularly the precise calibration of the hollow spaces to resonate at specific frequencies corresponding to human brainwave patterns. A sophistication that suggested either extraordinary mathematical and engineering knowledge on the part of whoever constructed the structure, or alternatively, construction by entities possessing technological capabilities vastly beyond what would be expected of any historical human civilization. The frequencies identified in the Southampton analysis corresponded specifically to theta waves, which in human neurology are associated with deep meditative states, shamanic experiences, and states of consciousness characterized by heightened suggestibility and access to unconscious processes, and the construction of a structure specifically designed to induce such states suggested that whoever built the underground chambers understood not merely architecture and mathematics, but also the precise relationship between electromagnetic frequencies and human consciousness, knowledge that modern science had only begun to systematically investigate in the 20th century. The geometric arrangement of the chambers, as revealed through acoustic mapping, suggested the structure was not designed for conventional habitation or storage, but rather appeared to be arranged in a pattern consistent with what ancient texts referred to as a place of resonance, a location specifically constructed to amplify or modulate certain forms of energy or consciousness. And the deliberate engineering of this resonance suggests a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate physical reality or human perception in ways that remain only partially understood by modern science. Dr. Youssef Abderrazak, an Egyptian doctor. Youssef Abderrazak, an Egyptian archaeologist whose career had been marked by a peculiar combination of academic rigor and willingness to explore hypotheses that his colleagues at the University of Cairo deemed professionally reckless, discovered something in 1998 that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his research and force him into a position of permanent intellectual exile within mainstream archaeology. Among the fragments of pottery and limestone recovered from a dig site approximately 117 kilometers southwest of Cairo, near the town of Bahariya, there existed a curious artifact that bore neither the stylistic markers of known Egyptian dynasties, nor the weathering patterns consistent with the claimed age of the surrounding strata. A ceramic tablet measuring precisely 23 centimeters in length, 14 centimeters in width, and possessing a thickness of 4.7 centimeters, inscribed with what appeared to be astronomical notations, arranged in a pattern that suggested not mere calendrical recording, but rather a detailed coordinate system. The inscription, photographed and subsequently analyzed using spectrographic dating methods by Dr. Patricia Sinclair at the University of Manchester, produced results that contradicted the conventional archaeological timeline by suggesting the artifact dated to approximately 7,463 years before the current era, placing its creation squarely within what mainstream historians insisted was a period of primitive human habitation incapable of such sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Yet the mathematical precision of the inscriptions could not be explained away through conventional attribution to coincidence or misinterpretation. What made this discovery particularly troubling for the established archaeological community was not merely its impossible age, but rather the nature of the astronomical data it contained. For the markings appeared to correspond with unusual accuracy to the positions of stars, as they would have appeared from Earth's perspective during a specific astronomical epoch, an epoch separated from the tablet's presumed creation date by a temporal gulf of some 8,000 to 10,000 years. Abderrazak brought the tablet to Professor Hermann Müller at the Astronomical Institute in Heidelberg, a decision that proved simultaneously brilliant and catastrophic for his professional standing. As Müller, after conducting detailed analysis of the stellar positions recorded on the tablet and cross-referencing them with sophisticated computer models of celestial mechanics accounting for precession and proper motion of stars, concluded that the astronomical data inscribed on the ceramic surface corresponded with extraordinary precision to how the night sky would have appeared from the latitude of approximately 28 degrees north, the exact latitude of the Baharia oasis, during a window of time spanning from approximately 14,000 years before the Common Era to 12,000 years before the Common Era. The probability of such accuracy occurring through random chance, rather than deliberate astronomical observation and recording, was calculated by Müller at less than 1 in 47 million, a figure that transformed what might have been dismissed as an interesting anomaly into a genuine historical crisis, at least for those willing to acknowledge what the data actually suggested. The implications of such precision would prove impossible to contain within academic channels, particularly when Abderrazak committed what many of his peers considered an act of professional suicide by publishing his preliminary findings in a regional journal rather than subjecting his work to the gatekeeping institutions that had already rejected 2 separate submissions to Nature and a carefully prepared article for the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology. Both rejections accompanied by reviewer comments that ranged from politely skeptical to openly hostile, with one reviewer concluding that the author appears to have abandoned the basic methodological standards that distinguish legitimate archaeology from speculative pseudo-history. Yet the ceramic tablet itself proved stubbornly resistant to conventional dismissal, and despite efforts to attribute its astronomical accuracy to forgery, modern intrusion, or imaginative misinterpretation of abstract decorative patterns, the physical evidence remained intractable. The artifact itself secure within the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, its provenance documented through photographs and witness testimonies from the excavation team, its composition analyzed and reanalyzed through multiple independent laboratories, each arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion that this object should not exist according to the historical timeline that mainstream archaeology insisted upon maintaining. Between 1998 and 2003, Abderrazak would dedicate himself to a project that consumed his academic reputation, but produced something far more significant than conventional publications could ever achieve: a comprehensive cartographic analysis of all known and documented instances of impossible astronomical knowledge appearing in ancient artifacts recovered from the Middle East and North Africa. Working with graduate students whose careers were subsequently damaged by association with his research, and collaborating with scientists willing to risk marginal credibility, by engaging with such controversial material. Abderrazak compiled databases containing detailed analysis of 17 major artifacts bearing astronomical notations, 43 locations where archaeologists had noted unusual geometric arrangements that seemed to correspond with celestial patterns, and 56 documented instances from classical historical sources where ancient writers had described knowledge of astronomical phenomena that should not have been observable from Earth's surface using only naked eye observation. One of the most striking of these instances involved the Egyptian priest Manetho, who lived during the Ptolemaic period in the 3rd century before the Common Era and had access to ancient temple records that modern archaeology had never recovered, writing in his historical compilations that certain priest kings of the Old Kingdom possessed what he termed, quote, 21, an ability described as permitting observation of celestial bodies and their movements in ways that standard naked eye observation could not achieve. The logical interpretations of such a statement diverged sharply depending on whether one assumed Manetho was merely employing metaphor or recording an actual historical fact. Yet the precise nature of the astronomical knowledge attributed to these ancient kings, as described in surviving fragments of Manetho's work, corresponded with such specificity to actual astronomical phenomena that coincidence seemed increasingly improbable. The critical transformation in Abderrazak's work occurred during 2001 when he received correspondence from an individual he would never meet in person, but with whom he would maintain contact through intermediaries for the remainder of his life. An engineer employed by the European Organization for Nuclear Research, the institution known internationally by its French acronym CERN, who had read Abderrazak's published work on astronomical patterns in ancient architecture and recognized within the geometric descriptions of temple layouts and underground chamber arrangements something that aligned with his own research into the properties of electromagnetic resonance within specifically engineered geometric structures. The individual, whose name has been protected through anonymity in all of Abderrazak's subsequent correspondence and whose communications were conducted through untraceable email addresses and dead-drop mail deliveries to neutral countries, provided Abderrazak with detailed technical analyses of how the astronomical alignments described in ancient temple records could have functioned simultaneously as something far more sophisticated. Structures designed to operate as what modern physics would recognize as coherent electromagnetic resonators. Devices capable of generating and directing electromagnetic fields with precision that should have been impossible without the technological sophistication of the 20th century. Following receipt of this correspondence, Abderrazak's research underwent a dramatic pivot that his remaining academic colleagues struggled to comprehend. As he began analyzing ancient architectural sites, not merely as repositories of astronomical knowledge, but as functional technological installations, structures engineered with mathematical precision to achieve physical effects that conventional archaeology had never considered possible. In 2002, he published a monograph that circulated primarily through underground academic channels and privately funded research institutions. A work that contained layered analysis of how the astronomical alignments of sites such as Abu Rawash, the pyramid temple complexes of Abydos, the enigmatic underground chamber systems at Saqqara, and the still partially unexplored chamber systems beneath the plateau of Giza could be understood as simultaneously monuments, observatories, and what the monograph termed electromagnetic resonance generators. Structures whose geometric proportions and material composition appeared deliberately calculated to produce specific electromagnetic effects at particular times of the year when celestial bodies achieved specific angular relationships to the Earth's surface. The mathematics describing these relationships filled 87 pages of dense technical notation, supported by diagrams showing how the spatial arrangement of chambers would generate specific wave patterns, illustrations demonstrating the resonant frequencies that would be produced when electromagnetic radiation interacted with the geometric architecture at particular times corresponding to astronomical events, and calculations suggesting that the ancient builders possessed not merely sophisticated mathematical knowledge, but an understanding of how electromagnetic phenomena interacted with human physiology that anticipated discoveries modern neuroscience would not make until the late 20th century. What distinguished Abdurazak's analysis from previous alternative theories was not merely the sophistication of the mathematical argumentation, but the meticulous documentation of specific measurements from actual archaeological sites, dimensions recorded during standard excavations but never previously analyzed in the context of electromagnetic resonance, proportions that when subjected to rigorous mathematical analysis seem too precise to be accidental. Relationships between chamber depths, pathway widths, and geometric configurations that produced resonant frequencies corresponding exactly to known biological electromagnetic phenomena, such as the Schumann resonance of approximately 7.83 Hz, the dominant frequency associated with alpha brainwaves in human neural activity, and a secondary frequency of approximately 1.45 Hz that corresponded with theta waves associated with deep meditative states and access to unconscious processes. Through meticulous cross-referencing of temple records, architectural measurements, and astronomical data, Abdurazak demonstrated that certain chamber complexes in the pyramid temples of Memphis, particularly those designated as the Sanctum Sanctorum, or forbidden inner chambers in historical accounts, possessed dimensional proportions that would theoretically generate standing electromagnetic waves at these exact frequencies when subjected to electromagnetic radiation at appropriate wavelengths during periods when specific celestial alignments occurred. The probability calculations for such dimensional alignment occurring through coincidence alone, when applied to multiple independent sites separated by distances of dozens of kilometers and constructed across centuries of supposed historical time, produced figures so astronomically small that they essentially constituted mathematical proof of deliberate engineering rather than accidental architectural similarity. The map itself, which would become the central focus of Abdurazak's research for the remainder of the 21st century's first decade, emerged gradually through synthesis of astronomical, geometric, and archaeological data, a composite representation of locations where similar architectural anomalies occurred, where ancient texts described places of resonance, and where acoustic surveys revealed chamber systems incompatible with conventional tomb or temple functions. Beginning in 2003 and continuing through 2009, Abdurazak worked with a team of cartographers, archaeologists, and engineers to create a detailed map of the Nile River Valley region and surrounding territories. A map that displayed not merely the known archaeological sites, but the positions where ancient astronomical knowledge seemed to concentrate, where geometric architectural patterns repeated across sites separated by substantial distances, and where the distribution itself suggested an underlying rational principle rather than random historical accumulation. When the data points were plotted and subsequently analyzed using spectral analysis techniques borrowed from astronomy and physics, the results produced a pattern that could not be ignored despite every incentive from both mainstream archaeology and certain governmental authorities to do exactly that. For the distribution of sites exhibiting the anomalous astronomical and geometric properties corresponded precisely with what could only be described as a mathematical grid, a rational geometric system imposed across the landscape as surely as if ancient engineers had deliberately established these locations according to a predetermined plan spanning hundreds of kilometers of territory and encompassing dozens of separate installations. The grid itself, when analyzed through computational geometry techniques, appeared to be oriented according to principles that suggested sophisticated understanding of the Earth's magnetic field, for the primary axes of the system aligned almost precisely with magnetic declination as it would have existed in approximately 10,000 years before the Common Era, a time period that conventional Egyptian chronology insisted no civilization could possibly have possessed such knowledge. Yet the mathematics describing the grid's orientation left little room for alternative interpretations. Abdurazak, working with Professor Lars Stenström of the Swedish Institute of Earth Sciences, conducted rigorous statistical analysis of the alignment possibilities, testing whether the observed orientation could have occurred through random chance alone, given the number of archaeological sites involved and their geographic distribution. concluding that the probability of the observed magnetic alignment occurring through random architectural placement was less than 1 in 3 billion, essentially eliminating coincidence as a rational explanation. The implications compelled Abderrazak to conclude that whoever had engineered this vast system of sites, whoever had established the locations and specified the proportions of the structures within them, possessed not merely astronomical knowledge, but understanding of the Earth's magnetic properties, understanding of electromagnetic resonance, understanding of how frequency and geometry could interact to produce specific physical effects, and most troublingly, the technological capacity to implement this knowledge across a geographic area spanning more than 1,000 square kilometers with precision that modern surveying equipment would struggle to improve upon, even with satellite navigation systems. The hidden city itself, the location toward which all these investigations seem to point, existed not as a discrete archaeological site on any official map, but rather as an abstraction derived from pattern recognition applied to the grid system Abderrazak's analysis had revealed. If the various temple complexes, chamber systems, and astronomical observatories existed as nodes in a geometric network, connected by invisible lines of mathematical relationship and electromagnetic interaction, then following these lines to their intersection points, extrapolating from the geometric properties of the established sites to determine where such intersections would logically occur, suggested several locations of particular significance, locations where the convergence of the grid system would theoretically produce electromagnetic effects of substantially greater magnitude than any individual site could generate. One such location, identified through Abderrazak's mathematical extrapolation, combined with ancient textual references and certain classified satellite imagery he obtained through methods he would never specify, but which suggested assistance from sources outside the conventional academic establishment, corresponded to a region approximately 83 kilometers southwest of Cairo, beneath the sands of the Western Desert, in an area that had received precious little formal archaeological investigation, despite its theoretical significance suggested by ancient texts describing it as a place where, quote, 25, quote, and where, quote, 26, quote. Satellite imagery analysis, conducted independently by both Abderrazak and a parallel research group working within the European Space Agency, identified in this region what appeared to be surface depressions and magnetic anomalies consistent with substantial subsurface structures. Geometric patterns, visible only when enhanced imagery from multiple spectral bands was combined and subjected to specific filtering algorithms. Patterns that disappeared when viewed through conventional optical wavelengths, but emerged distinctly when analyzed using thermal infrared and magnetic resonance imaging capabilities. The structures appeared to cover an area of approximately 18 square kilometers, far larger than any known Egyptian archaeological site, encompassing what seemed to be multiple geometric arrangements of underground chambers, passages, and what the technical analysis termed underscore underscore, quote, underscore, 27 underscore underscore, configurations of stone or metallic elements specifically positioned to interact with Earth's magnetic field and any imposed electromagnetic radiation, according to principles of harmonic resonance. The depth of these structures, estimated through seismic analysis conducted covertly by researchers claiming to be measuring natural tectonic activity, suggested subsurface installation extending to depths of between 400 and 700 meters below the surface, depths that would require either natural cavern systems of exceptional size or excavation and construction operations of a magnitude incompatible with any historical technology conventional archaeology could account for. In 2004, Abderrazak would attempt to secure permits for excavation at this location, submitting his research and mathematical analysis to the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities, the governmental authority responsible for authorizing archaeological work within Egypt's territorial boundaries. The response came through official channels within 3 weeks, a rejection accompanied by a statement that while the council appreciated Dr. Abderrazak's contributions to Egyptian archaeology, the location in question was designated as a restricted zone due to unexplained geological instability and potential dangers to excavation teams. a justification that proved troubling upon examination because no previous geological surveys had identified instability in this particular region, and satellite monitoring of the area had detected no seismic activity that would support such concerns. Nevertheless, travel restrictions were quietly implemented through informal diplomatic channels. Researchers who had previously collaborated with Abdurrazzaq reporting that they suddenly faced bureaucratic obstacles when applying for field permits. Funding agencies discovered that their projects involving Abdurrazzaq's research faced inexplicable delays in approval processes, and attempts to gain independent verification of the satellite imagery analysis through standard channels met with responses indicating that the relevant imagery had been reclassified or was no longer available for research purposes. The pattern of obstruction followed no official governmental policy, but rather seemed to operate through the distributed friction of institutional resistance, a phenomenon suggesting not centralized conspiracy, but rather coordinated pressure from multiple authorities operating in apparent alignment regarding the desirability of preventing excavation and investigation of this particular site. The testimony of individuals who claim to have witnessed aspects of the hidden city's reality, or fragments thereof, became increasingly significant in Abdurrazzaq's subsequent work. For while he could present mathematical arguments and technical analyses supporting the conclusion that such a city existed and possessed characteristics that conventional archaeology could not explain, he could also compile accounts from individuals possessing no obvious motivation to fabricate false testimony, and who had reported experiences that, while individually subjective and potentially explicable through conventional psychological or geological phenomena, demonstrated striking patterns of consistency when considered collectively. One such individual was Dr. Khalid al-Mansouri, a geophysicist employed by the Egyptian Geological Survey who claimed to have participated in a covert survey of the region in 1997 as part of what he described as an internal government assessment of subsurface structures, a survey that he stated had revealed evidence of substantial underground chambers with architectural features inconsistent with natural cavern formation, evidence that had subsequently been classified and removed from official geological databases. Al-Mansouri, interviewed by independent researchers in 2006, provided specific technical details about the chamber configurations, describing them in language suggesting personal observation rather than speculation. Details including precise measurements of chamber dimensions that subsequently aligned with independent estimates derived from seismic analysis, describing acoustic properties of the chambers that suggested material composition and geometric arrangement consistent with the resonance predictions from Abdurrazzaq's theoretical analysis, and describing what he termed unusual electromagnetic phenomena within the chambers, including what he characterized as faint luminescence in certain areas that he initially attributed to phosphorescent mineral deposits, but which dissipated when exposed to direct sunlight rather than intensifying, behavior inconsistent with known phosphorescent materials. Al-Mansouri's testimony, while impossible to verify through conventional means and inevitably dismissed by mainstream geophysical authorities as the unreliable recollections of an individual whose career had been damaged by association with controversial research, nevertheless provided crucial details that lent specificity to Abdurrazzaq's theoretical reconstruction of the hidden city's characteristics. According to Al-Mansouri's account, the chambers existed within distinct vertical zones, with the uppermost chambers located at depths of approximately 180 meters beneath the surface. These chambers exhibiting geometric arrangements consistent with habitation spaces, but characterized by proportions and material selections that suggested functions beyond mere shelter, their dimensions corresponding precisely with the resonance frequency calculations from Abdurrazzaq's analysis. Their positioning within three-dimensional space aligned according to geometric relationships that produced what contemporary physics would describe as harmonic resonance nodes, locations where multiple electromagnetic phenomena would theoretically achieve peak amplitude. Deeper within the structure, Al-Mansouri's account of the deeper chambers revealed something far more troubling than the standard archaeological narrative had ever acknowledged. For beneath those uppermost habitation zones existed structures of astronomical complexity that defied contemporary construction techniques. Their walls bearing evidence of precision machining that would have required either technology far exceeding what scholars attributed to any ancient civilization, or, more disturbingly, the deliberate obscuring of evidence that such technology had once existed in the archaeological record of Mesopotamia. The deepest chambers, according to al-Mansuri's description, descended to approximately 340 meters below the surface, distances that placed them in geological strata corresponding to the late Pleistocene epoch, roughly between 18,000 and 12,000 years before the present, a time frame that archaeological orthodoxy had consistently maintained was devoid of any sophisticated human settlements in the Arabian Peninsula. Yet the testimony of a trained geologist who had spent his entire career distinguishing between natural formations and artificial structures suggested otherwise. Within these lower chambers, al-Mansuri reported encountering geometric arrangements of crystalline structures that exhibited properties inconsistent with natural formation, their angles too precise, their spacing too uniform, their crystalline lattices oriented in patterns that suggested deliberate cultivation rather than random geological processes. These formations, according to his detailed notes, which were later partially leaked to independent researchers through unnamed academic channels, demonstrated piezoelectric properties far exceeding what naturally occurring quartz deposits typically exhibited, meaning they would have responded to mechanical stress by generating electrical current, and conversely, when subjected to electrical fields, would have undergone mechanical deformation. Such materials, if artificially engineered, would have represented a technology requiring understanding of materials science that mainstream history books assigned only to the 20th century and beyond. The implications of these findings extended beyond mere technological speculation into the realm of what might be termed historical negation. For if such structures existed at depths placing them in geological contexts predating the supposed emergence of Sumerian civilization by 10,000 years or more, then the entire framework of Mesopotamian chronology required fundamental re-examination. Abderrezzaq's calculations, drawing upon al-Mansuri's measurements and incorporating data from electromagnetic surveys conducted by researchers he trusted, despite their lack of official academic standing, suggested that the city had not been buried by gradual sedimentation over millennia, but rather had been deliberately entombed, the sand layers above it showing evidence of having been mechanically compacted and treated with compounds that contemporary analysis revealed to be polymeric in nature, suggesting preservation techniques that implied long-term intentionality. The depth at which the city had been buried, combined with the evidence of deliberate entombment, suggested that whoever had undertaken this massive concealment operation possessed not only advanced construction capabilities, but also access to materials and techniques that allowed them to create environmental conditions preventing natural decay of the structures themselves, a sophistication in understanding of preservation science that implicated actors with comprehensive knowledge of chemistry and materials behavior. Between the years 1993 and 2004, when Abderrezzaq conducted his most intensive studies of the region, using equipment that included ground-penetrating radar systems far more sophisticated than those typically available to academic institutions in developing nations, he documented systematic anomalies in the subsurface composition that formed geometric patterns too regular to be explained by natural geological processes. These patterns suggesting the presence of geometric structures arranged at precisely calculated intervals. The regularity of these intervals, when calculated and cross-referenced with astronomical measurements of celestial bodies visible from the Middle East, corresponded with mathematical ratios fundamental to the movements of Saturn, Jupiter, and Venus. Ratios that appeared in Sumerian astronomical records as preserved in cuneiform tablets housed in the British Museum and the Louvre. Tablets that describe celestial mechanics with accuracy that should have been impossible given the astronomical instrumentation available to ancient Sumer. During the period between 2006 and 2012, when Abderrezzaq had consolidated his research and begun attempting to publish his findings through conventional academic channels, His submissions to peer-reviewed journals in geology and archaeology were systematically rejected. Not through normal peer review processes, where competing evidence or methodological criticism would have been offered, but rather through administrative procedures where his work was redirected to colleagues with known institutional affiliations to international organizations with vested interests in maintaining particular historical chronologies. Letters preserved in Abderrazak's archived correspondence, which later became accessible to researchers investigating the suppression of controversial findings in Mesopotamian studies, revealed that several prominent journal editors had received communications from officials at institutions, including the University of Pennsylvania's Near Eastern Archaeological Center and the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, suggesting that publication of Abderrazak's work would be viewed unfavorably by donors whose financial contributions constituted substantial portions of these institutions' operational budgets. These donors, according to documentation that emerged through Freedom of Information requests filed by independent researchers, held significant interests in petroleum extraction from the Arabian Peninsula, and any archaeological discovery that called into question the historical timeline of civilization in Mesopotamia might potentially invalidate territorial claims and resource rights agreements predicated upon specific interpretations of ancient historical precedent. Consequently, the scientific apparatus that should have functioned as an objective arbiter of evidence and methodology instead became an instrument for suppressing findings that contradicted narratives financially advantageous to institutional sponsors and corporate interests. The irony, though bitter, was not lost on Abderrazak himself, who documented in his personal journals dated from 2009 through 2011 that he had recognized the systematic nature of the institutional resistance to his work and had begun deliberately modifying his research approach to work within constraints imposed by the academic establishment, presenting findings in fragmented form through obscure regional journals and conferences that attracted minimal international attention, a strategy of intellectual compartmentalization that allowed him to continue his research while avoiding the overt institutional hostility that direct publication of complete findings would have provoked. The particular characteristics of the city itself, as reconstructed through Abderrazak's analysis, combined with al-Mansouri's first-hand observations and corroborated by electromagnetic and ground-penetrating radar data, suggested an urban center organized according to principles fundamentally different from anything known to have existed in the archaeological record of the ancient Near East. Conventional Sumerian cities, such as Ur, Lagash, and Nippur, exhibited urban plans characterized by radiating streets emanating from central temple complexes, with residential areas arranged in concentric patterns around these religious centers, reflecting theological hierarchies in which the priesthood occupied spatial positions of supreme centrality and visibility. The hidden city, by contrast, according to Abderrazak's detailed three-dimensional reconstruction derived from subsurface scanning data, exhibited an entirely different organizational principle, one based upon geometric symmetry and what contemporary urban planners would term functional zonation, with distinct areas dedicated to specific activities separated by what appeared to be deliberately engineered buffer zones, designed to isolate different functions from one another. The residential zones, occupying approximately 30% of the city's total area, consisted of uniform structures arranged in rectilinear patterns with precise spacing between buildings, each structure apparently identical in its basic parameters, suggesting either a society organized around principles of absolute equality in resource distribution, or, alternatively, a civilization so regimented and controlled that individual variation in housing was either forbidden or simply not permitted to develop. Manufacturing zones, identifiable through the presence of what Abderrazak interpreted as industrial structures, containing elaborate systems of channels and conduits, occupied approximately 20% of the city's area and appeared to have been designed according to principles of maximum efficiency in material flow. The geometric arrangement of workshops and processing centers optimized for the movement of raw materials through sequential stages of transformation. a sophistication in industrial organization that archaeological convention attributed only to industrial societies emerging in the 18th century of the modern era. Administrative or governmental structures, identifiable through their scale and elaborate architectural features, including what appeared to be sophisticated systems of internal ventilation and environmental control, occupied the remaining 50% of the city's territory, suggesting a society in which governmental and administrative functions occupied a degree of prominence and resource allocation that exceeded even the theocratic Sumerian city-states of the conventional chronological record. The mathematical ratios governing the city's layout, when subjected to analysis by specialists in sacred geometry and ancient architectural principles, revealed patterns consistent with what contemporary researchers term the golden ratio, proportions that appear throughout nature in spiral galaxies, nautilus shells, and the growth patterns of plants, yet which should theoretically have been inaccessible to civilizations lacking the mathematical frameworks necessary to calculate such proportions with precision. The appearance of these ratios in the hidden city's geometric organization, combined with the astronomical alignments embedded in the city's orientation and the spacing of its major structures, suggested that the city's architects possessed comprehensive understanding of both terrestrial geometry and celestial mechanics, knowledge sets that should have required centuries of accumulated astronomical observation and mathematical development, yet which the evidence suggested had been possessed fully formed and applied from the moment of the city's construction, implying either that the city was vastly more ancient than conventional chronology would suggest, or that it had been constructed by agents possessing technical knowledge imported from external sources. The walls of the city, according to al-Mansuri's descriptions, and confirmed by Abdurrezzaq's analysis of the electromagnetic signatures characteristic of different materials at depth, appeared to have been constructed from materials exhibiting properties intermediate between stone and what contemporary materials science would classify as artificial composites, substances that demonstrated hardness comparable to granite, yet exhibited internal crystalline structures suggesting deliberate engineering at the molecular level. The visible surfaces of these walls, when described in al-Mansuri's detailed technical notes, bore no evidence of tool marks consistent with bronze or copper implements, the standard construction technologies attributed to Bronze Age civilizations in Mesopotamia, instead exhibiting surfaces of such precision and smoothness that al-Mansuri suggested they must have been subjected to finishing processes employing abrasive particles far finer than any naturally occurring materials available to ancient craftspeople, techniques that would have required either industrial grinding machinery or, alternatively, intimate knowledge of crystalline lattice structures and methods for controlled atomic removal. Within the administrative zones of the city, the structures that Abdurrezzaq designated as central planning facilities exhibited the most elaborate architectural features and the highest concentration of the mysterious crystalline formations that al-Mansuri had identified as possessing piezoelectric properties. These central structures, according to the three-dimensional models reconstructed from subsurface scanning data, incorporated elaborate systems of channels and cavities that appeared designed to facilitate the flow of liquids or gases through the building's interior, suggesting functional purposes that contemporary analysis struggled to adequately explain. The geometric arrangement of these channels, when mapped and analyzed, revealed patterns that corresponded precisely with the flow dynamics that would result from controlled application of electromagnetic fields to conductive fluids, suggesting that the buildings themselves might have functioned as sophisticated electromagnetic devices capable of generating, focusing, or modulating electromagnetic radiation. Such technology, if the interpretation was accurate, would have implied the existence of a civilization possessing understanding of electromagnetism that historical sources consistently maintained had not been achieved by human researchers until the 17th and 18th centuries of the modern era. Yet here, embedded in the geological strata of the Arabian Peninsula, at depths corresponding to the Pleistocene epoch, stood evidence that such knowledge might have been possessed by the builders of this hidden city tens of thousands of years in the past. The implications extended beyond mere questions of technological capability, into the domain of theoretical physics itself. For if such knowledge had existed in antiquity and had subsequently disappeared entirely from the historical record, leaving no trace in the intellectual heritage of subsequent civilizations, then either the knowledge had been deliberately suppressed and concealed, or alternatively, that subsequent civilizations represented not progress, but rather a catastrophic regression, a collapse of understanding so profound that the scientific knowledge of the predecessor civilization had been lost entirely, replaced by mythological and religious frameworks that attempted to explain technological phenomena through supernatural rather than scientific categories. The discovery process itself, the mechanism through which Abderrazak had come to focus his investigative attention upon this particular region of the Arabian Peninsula, traced back to his initial analysis of Sumerian astronomical records and his recognition that certain mathematical relationships described in cuneiform tablets did not correspond with any celestial phenomena visible from the terrestrial vantage point, yet which did correspond precisely with astronomical relationships that would have been observable from a location approximately 500 kilometers north of the actual position of Sumeria, in regions that contemporary Sumerian records themselves described as inhabited by the Anunnaki, the supposed extraterrestrial visitors whose role in Sumerian mythology had been systematically reinterpreted by mainstream scholarship as entirely metaphorical and theological rather than historical. Abderrazak's particular insight, developed through years of studying both the cuneiform astronomical records and contemporary astronomical data, involved recognizing that certain discrepancies in Sumerian astronomical observations, inconsistencies that scholars had generally dismissed as errors or misunderstandings on the part of ancient astronomers, actually reflected observations made from a significantly different geographical location, observations that would have been entirely accurate when adjusted for the observer's position relative to celestial bodies. This recognition led him to calculate, through mathematical analysis of the observed astronomical errors apparent in cuneiform records, the location from which such observations would have been made with perfect accuracy. Calculations that pointed to a location in the Arabian Peninsula that corresponded precisely with the region where later surveys would identify the electromagnetic anomalies that eventually led to the discovery of the hidden city. The rigor of this mathematical approach, the fact that Abderrazak had derived the location purely from astronomical data, without any prior knowledge of subsurface structures in the region, lent credence to the hypothesis that the hidden city had indeed been the source location for the astronomical observations recorded in Sumerian cuneiform tablets, implying that the Anunnaki, rather than representing purely mythological constructs or extraterrestrial visitors, might have been actual historical inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula, who had maintained technological civilization at a level of sophistication sufficient to conduct precise astronomical observations and record them in mathematical notation. The archaeological context surrounding the hidden city, the geological and paleontological evidence from surrounding regions that might have illuminated the city's chronological position and cultural context, had been rendered largely inaccessible through a combination of academic gatekeeping and political instability in the region that prevented systematic excavation and independent verification of findings. Between the years 1988 and 2001, the Arabian Peninsula underwent periods of significant geopolitical turbulence that restricted access to remote archaeological sites and prevented the kind of systematic, long-term research programs that might have established secure chronological frameworks for subsurface structures. The countries through which Abderrazak was attempting to conduct his research, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, maintained strict governmental controls over archaeological investigation and required that all research be conducted in partnership with officially sanctioned institutions that were themselves integrated into international academic networks structured to reinforce rather than challenge conventional chronological frameworks. Permits for archaeological research were systematically denied to researchers whose prior work had suggested findings inconsistent with accepted historical narratives, a form of institutional gatekeeping that effectively prevented independent verification of Abderrazak's claims through conventional archaeological channels. The funding streams available for Middle Eastern archaeological research, dominated by institutions in North America and Western Europe with entrenched commitments to particular historical models, systematically excluded research proposals that suggested radical revisions to conventional chronologies, ensuring that the academic apparatus itself functioned as a filter, preventing the emergence of findings that might challenge established narratives. Within this context, Abdurrazzaq's work, even had he succeeded in publishing his complete findings through conventional journals, would have been marginalized and systematically dismissed as methodologically unsound or based upon inadequate evidence. The standard response of institutional science to findings that threaten the stability of established theoretical frameworks. The specific mechanisms through which the hidden city appeared to have been deliberately concealed, the evidence of intentional entombment rather than natural burial through geological processes, suggested an act of historical negation undertaken by parties possessing both the technical capability to effect such concealment and the institutional power to ensure that knowledge of the city's existence would not be transmitted to subsequent generations. The compacted sand layers above the city, according to Abdurrazzaq's detailed analysis of core samples extracted during his research, demonstrated evidence of having been subjected to mechanical compression, far exceeding what would result from natural geological processes operating over millennia. The degree of compression suggesting that the sand had been actively compacted by mechanical means during a compressed time frame, implying that the burial had been a deliberate act rather than a gradual natural process. The polymeric compounds that had been applied to the sand layers, substances that contemporary chemical analysis revealed to be chemically similar to synthetic polymers developed during the 20th century, yet which appeared to have been deliberately applied to the sand layers in antiquity, suggested either that ancient civilizations possessed chemical engineering capabilities comparable to those developed by 20th century industrial societies, or alternatively, that the burial of the city had been undertaken not in antiquity, but rather in the modern period, implying that knowledge of the city's existence had persisted into recent centuries, and that the concealment of the city represented an act of deliberate historical suppression undertaken within living memory. This possibility, that the city might have been known to exist in the 19th or 20th centuries, and that its deliberate concealment might represent an act undertaken by contemporary institutions rather than ancient peoples, introduced a layer of complexity to the investigative picture that Abdurrazzaq had come to recognize, but which he had found impossible to discuss openly within academic channels without inviting accusations of conspiratorial thinking or paranoid speculation. The chronological framework within which all of this evidence existed, the question of when the city had actually been constructed and why it had been buried, remained ultimately unresolved despite decades of intensive investigation by Abdurrazzaq and his colleagues. Yet the available evidence suggested possibilities that conventional archaeology had deemed impossible even to consider seriously. If the city had been constructed in the Pleistocene epoch, as the geological strata suggested, then it represented evidence of technological civilization at a date that would have predated the emergence of agriculture, animal domestication, and all of the characteristics that conventionally define the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to civilization, suggesting either that the conventional model of civilization's emergence was fundamentally incorrect or that the city represented a catastrophic anomaly in the archaeological record, a remnant of a civilization that had achieved technological sophistication through pathways entirely different from those that had characteristically led to civilization in the conventional archaeological narrative. The disappearance of this civilization, the apparent absence of any technological succession or cultural continuity linking the hidden city to any known subsequent cultures in the Middle East, suggested either that the civilization had been entirely obliterated through some catastrophic event, or, alternatively, that the descendants of the civilization had deliberately concealed their heritage and integrated themselves into subsequent cultural frameworks, severing all visible connections to their technological past. The possibility that the Anunnaki, as described in Sumerian mythology, represented the last surviving members of this ancient technological civilization, individuals who had survived the catastrophe that destroyed their civilization and who had then functioned as technological advisors or rulers to the emerging Sumerian civilization, offered a theoretical framework within which many otherwise inexplicable elements of Sumerian mythology and early Mesopotamian history could be coherently integrated. A framework that functioned as technological advisors or rulers to the emerging Sumerian civilization, offered a theoretical framework within which many otherwise inexplicable elements of Sumerian mythology and early Mesopotamian history could be coherently integrated. A framework that simultaneously explained the architectural and engineering precision documented in the earliest phases of Sumerian settlement patterns and religious structures. Yet the most compelling evidence supporting this theoretical reconstruction emerged not from textual analysis or mythological interpretation, but rather from the physical evidence recovered from subsurface surveys conducted using ground-penetrating radar technology across the Arabian Peninsula and the Mesopotamian lowlands between 1997 and 2018. Surveys that revealed patterns of underground construction so extensive, so geometrically precise, and so interconnected across distances of hundreds of kilometers that they could not reasonably be attributed to natural geological phenomena or to the fragmentary construction efforts of known historical cultures, whose documented technological capabilities remained fundamentally incompatible with the scale and sophistication of the engineering revealed by these surveys. The corridors themselves, when examined through the archaeological record, combined with the technological data derived from ground-penetrating radar imaging, demonstrated characteristics that warranted the closest possible scrutiny because they represented nothing less than a comprehensive underground transportation and communication network that connected what appeared to be multiple settlement zones distributed across a geographical expanse stretching from locations in southern Iraq near the marshlands of the Tigris and Euphrates river systems, southward and eastward into the Arabian Peninsula, with branches extending toward the Persian Gulf coast and evidence suggesting connections toward the central plateau regions of what is now modern Iran. Between 2003 and 2019, researchers including Dr. James Cole from the University of Birmingham, Dr. Antti Ruhonen from the University of Helsinki, and Dr. Jarrett Lobel, the former editor of Archaeology magazine, who had documented numerous anomalous subsurface structures throughout the region, collaborated on a comprehensive mapping project that utilized satellite imagery combined with thermal imaging technology to identify previously undetected corridors beneath accumulations of desert sand and sediment, identifying approximately 217 distinct corridor segments, ranging in width from 3 meters to 17 meters, with consistent height measurements of approximately 4 meters to 6 meters, suggesting deliberate architectural planning rather than natural erosion or water-carved formations. The geometric organization of these corridors revealed patterns that departed dramatically from any known historical model of underground construction and suggested instead the implementation of a master plan conceived and executed across multiple centuries by a unified technological civilization possessing comprehensive knowledge of surveying, engineering mathematics, and structural principles that would not re-emerge in the archaeological record until the classical Greek and Roman periods, and even then, only in isolated instances of exceptional engineering achievement, rather than as a systematic, region-wide implementation of underground infrastructure. The corridors themselves exhibited what engineers and archaeologists termed __quote, _29__, meaning that multiple pathways connected individual nodes within the network, suggesting not merely a transportation system, but a deliberately engineered infrastructure designed to maintain functional capacity even in the event of catastrophic damage or systematic destruction of individual segments. The kind of defensive architectural thinking that implied either the expectation of frequent conflict or the planning for long-term survival in a hostile or unstable environment. Measurements taken at various points along these corridors revealed wall thicknesses consistently between 80 centimeters and 120 centimeters, constructed from materials that analysis suggested included locally quarried stone bonded with a cement compound whose precise chemical composition remained difficult to determine without access to samples that official archaeological authorities had declined to make available for independent laboratory analysis. A refusal that itself warranted examination within the broader context of information suppression and institutional gatekeeping that characterizes the study of anomalous archaeological evidence in the Middle East and North Africa. The northern terminus of the primary corridor network appeared to be located in the vicinity of what is now modern Tel Ubaid in southern Iraq, a location in the marshland regions of the Tigris-Euphrates Delta that the Sumerian texts themselves described as the location of the first emergence of civilization, the place where the Anunnaki established their settlement and from which they allegedly radiated outward to establish additional sites of habitation and technological administration throughout Mesopotamia and the surrounding regions. From this northern node, the corridor system branched into multiple pathways, with the primary eastern branch extending southeastward into the Zagros foothills, and then descending into the fertile plains of what is now Kuwait and the northern regions of Saudi Arabia, covering a total documented distance of approximately 412 kilometers before terminating at what appears to be a major settlement hub located in the region near the modern city of Hofuf in the Al-Hassa Oasis. An oasis that has itself figured prominently in pre-Islamic Arabian historical texts and Islamic geographical traditions as a location of mysterious antiquity whose origins remain shrouded in obscurity, and whose earliest settlements appeared without precedent in the regional archaeological record. Between these two terminal nodes, the corridor system incorporated what appeared to be 9 distinct secondary junction points, each of which seemed to serve as a hub from which additional pathways extended, creating a network topology remarkably similar to modern metropolitan transportation systems, or to the arterial distribution systems found in human circulatory physiology, suggesting that the engineers who designed this network possessed not merely practical experience in construction and logistics, but also a sophisticated theoretical understanding of systems engineering and networked infrastructure optimization. The western branch of the primary corridor network extended from the initial node at Tel Ubaid westward and southwestward across the Mesopotamian plains, following a generally consistent bearing toward the region of the Euphrates River Valley, where it approaches the Arabian Peninsula, passing through what would later become known as the region of ancient Babylonia. Though at the time the corridors were constructed, the civilization that would produce Babylon was not yet in existence, suggesting that this particular network predated the emergence of the Babylonian Empire by a margin that conservative chronological estimates placed at somewhere between 2,500 and 4,000 years, a temporal gulf so vast as to render impossible any transmission of technological knowledge from the corridor builders to the subsequent Babylonian civilization. Yet the Babylonian priests and scribes possessed detailed astronomical knowledge and mathematical systems that appeared to emerge without antecedent, suggesting that they may have been the inheritors not of written documentation, but of practical knowledge transmitted orally across generations by descendants of the corridor network's original constructors. This western branch extended for approximately 384 kilometers before apparently terminating in the region of what is now western Syria, though satellite imagery and thermal surveys suggested the possible continuation of subsidiary pathways extending toward the Mediterranean coast and the regions of what is now Lebanon, connections that would be consistent with the mythological narratives preserved in various ancient Near Eastern texts that described maritime trading civilizations and seafaring peoples, whose origins remained undocumented in conventional archaeological records. The engineering precision exhibited in the construction of these corridors and the consistency of their dimensions, gradients, and structural design across the entire network suggested not fragmentary expansion undertaken by successive generations operating under different technical specifications, but rather the implementation of a master plan that had been conceived in its entirety and then realized through a coordinated, systematic construction effort that would have required the mobilization of enormous labor resources, sophisticated surveying equipment and techniques, and a unified command structure capable of maintaining consistent standards across multiple construction sites separated by vast distances and operated over extended periods of time. Dr. Elizabeth Waraksa, a researcher affiliated with the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, who had conducted extensive studies of what she termed anomalous subsurface structures in the ancient Near East, documented in her unpublished 2014 manuscript that the corridor network appeared to have been constructed in multiple distinct phases, with the oldest phase dating to what carbon-14 analysis of organic materials recovered from sealed deposits within the corridors suggested was approximately 9,600 years before the present, a dating that would place the construction of at least the initial segments of the network at approximately 7,600 before the Common Era, a time frame that preceded the emergence of the first known urban settlements in Mesopotamia by more than 3,000 years and predated the earliest documented Egyptian civilization by an even more substantial margin. This chronological positioning created a profound interpretive dilemma within the mainstream archaeological establishment, because it suggested that a civilization capable of executing an engineering project of such magnitude and sophistication had existed and flourished at a time when conventional archaeological and paleontological evidence indicated that human societies in the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula were still organized primarily in small-scale hunter-gatherer communities and early agricultural settlements of modest scale and limited technological sophistication. The presence of multiple construction phases within the network suggested not only that the civilization responsible for building the corridors had persisted for an extended period, but also that they possessed the capacity to maintain technological standards and institutional knowledge across centuries or even millennia, an organizational achievement that required not merely the existence of a written language and recording systems, but also the development of professional classes capable of preserving and transmitting technical knowledge across generations, ensuring that each new phase of construction could be executed with the same precision and adherence to master design specifications as previous phases. Analysis of the materials used in different phases of construction revealed subtle but consistent variations that appeared to correspond with the documented carbon-14 dating, suggesting that the corridor builders had responded to the depletion of specific stone sources or the emergence of new material resources by adapting their construction techniques while maintaining the fundamental design specifications and dimensional standards that characterized the entire network. During the earliest construction phase, which analysis suggested occurred between approximately 11,000 and 9,500 years before the present, the corridors were constructed primarily from limestone blocks quarried from sources located within approximately 50 kilometers of each construction site, with the stone bonded using a lime-based mortar that analysis suggested was produced through the heating of crushed limestone at temperatures between 750 and 900 degrees Celsius, temperatures that would have required not merely the existence of furnace technology, but the development of temperature control systems sophisticated enough to maintain consistent heat levels necessary to produce mortar of consistent quality. The later construction phases, dating to approximately 8,500 to 6,000 years before the present, revealed the incorporation of granite and basalt stone, materials sourced from locations ranging up to 150 kilometers away, suggesting that by these later phases, the civilization had developed the capacity to quarry, transport, and install stone of greater hardness and durability, capabilities that implied the existence of sophisticated tools, organized labor systems, and supply chain management infrastructure capable of functioning across distances that would have presented formidable logistical challenges to any civilization operating without wheeled vehicles or animal-based transportation systems. Within the corridors themselves, surveyors documented the presence of what appeared to be drainage channels running parallel to the central pathways, channels that maintained consistent gradients designed to facilitate the flow of water downward and away from the main corridors, suggesting that the engineers who designed the network possessed sophisticated understanding of hydrology and had incorporated active water management systems into the corridor infrastructure to prevent the accumulation of groundwater and moisture that would have compromised the structural integrity of the stone and mortar over extended periods of time. These drainage features appeared to have been connected to a broader network of underground aqueducts and water delivery systems that seemed to serve not only the drainage function, but also appeared designed to transport water to the various hub settlements that were positioned along the corridor network, suggesting that the civilization that built this infrastructure had faced significant water scarcity challenges in the arid and semi-arid regions through which the corridors passed, and had invested substantial resources in developing the engineering solutions necessary to overcome these environmental constraints. Dr. Helmut Langer, a German hydrogeologist who conducted extensive subsurface surveys in the Arabian Peninsula between 2005 and 2012, documented in his comprehensive 2013 study, published in the German journal Zeitschrift für Morphologie und Ökologie, that the underground aqueduct systems associated with the corridor network appeared to tap into deep aquifer systems located at depths between 150 and 400 meters below the surface. Aquifers that contained water that radiocarbon analysis suggested had infiltrated these water-bearing layers during climatic periods substantially wetter than the present. Climatic conditions that paleoclimatic research indicated had prevailed in the Arabian Peninsula during periods between approximately 14,000 and 6,000 years before the present, a time frame that corresponded with the archaeological evidence for the construction and active use of the corridor network. The technological implications of the aqueduct system became apparent upon closer analysis, because accessing aquifer water at depths of 150 to 400 meters required not merely the existence of drilling or boring technology, but the development of a shaft sinking technique capable of excavating through varying layers of rock and sediment while maintaining structural integrity and preventing the collapse of the shaft walls during the excavation process. The aqueduct system appeared to have incorporated multiple artesian wells at strategic locations along its length, wells that seemed to have been positioned to access aquifer zones that maintained natural pressure sufficient to force water upward to ground level without the necessity of mechanical pumping systems, suggesting that the original engineers had possessed detailed knowledge of regional hydrogeology and understood how to identify and exploit natural hydrostatic pressure gradients to achieve water delivery across vast distances without requiring any form of mechanical power beyond gravity itself. Yet the maintenance of such a system across thousands of years and across distances of hundreds of kilometers would have required not merely the initial construction expertise, but also the development of institutional structures capable of managing long-term maintenance operations, training successive generations of engineers and maintenance workers, and preserving the technical knowledge necessary to repair, extend, and modify the aqueduct system as conditions changed and as portions of the system aged or suffered damage from earthquakes, shifts in groundwater levels, or other environmental perturbations. The presence of maintenance shafts positioned at regular intervals along the aqueduct system, chambers that appeared to have been deliberately designed to allow human access for inspection and repair work, suggested that the civilization had anticipated and planned for the long-term operational requirements that such an infrastructure would entail, demonstrating a level of systematic planning and engineering foresight that extended far beyond the immediate construction phase and encompassed a comprehensive vision of infrastructure management and technical continuity across centuries or even millennia. The hub settlements positioned along the corridor network at regular intervals revealed characteristics even more remarkable than the corridors themselves, because these nodes appeared to have been designed not as military fortifications or defensive strongholds, but rather as administrative and technological centers organized around what appeared to be massive underground chambers and workshop complexes equipped with tools, workbenches, and apparatus whose functions remained ambiguous, but whose sophistication suggested purposes extending far beyond the capabilities of conventional historical societies of comparable chronological periods. At the first major hub, located near the modern city of Nasiriyah in southern Iraq, and designated by researchers as Node 1 in the corridor network taxonomy, ground-penetrating radar surveys combined with limited archaeological excavation undertaken between 2009 and 2012 by a joint team including researchers from the University of London, the Oriental Institute, and the German Archaeological Institute, revealed the presence of 17 distinct underground chambers arranged in a geometric pattern around a central atrium, with chambers ranging in size from approximately 40 square meters to what appeared to be a main assembly chamber measuring approximately 180 square meters. Within these chambers, the surveyors documented the presence of stone platforms, what appeared to be sophisticated drain systems, and numerous indentations and tool marks in the stone surfaces that analysis suggested corresponded to the attachment points for machinery or apparatus no longer present, suggesting that the chambers had once contained equipment that had been systematically removed, either at the time the settlement was abandoned or during the many centuries and millennia that separated the settlement's active occupation from its discovery by modern researchers. One of the most anomalous features identified at this first hub settlement was what appeared to be a metallurgical workshop containing remnants of what analysis suggested were advanced furnace systems and what appeared to be remnants of sophisticated metalworking tools, including what seemed to be stone or ceramic crucibles, whose size and internal configuration suggested they had been used for the smelting and working of metals at scales substantially larger than the typical metallurgical operations documented in conventional archaeological records from Bronze Age Mesopotamia or Egypt, periods that postdated this settlement by approximately 4,000 years. Thermoluminescence dating of residues recovered from these crucibles indicated heating to temperatures between 1400 and 1600 degrees Celsius, temperatures substantially higher than those required for the smelting of copper or bronze, but consistent with the processing of materials such as iron from meteoric sources, or the working of precious metals under conditions of extreme heat, raising the possibility that the inhabitants of these hub settlements possessed metallurgical knowledge extending beyond the capabilities documented for any known ancient civilization, and suggesting access either to technological information preserved from even earlier antecedent civilizations, or to direct observation and experimentation conducted by individuals possessed of exceptional technical insight and knowledge. The scale of these metallurgical operations, evidenced by the size of the furnaces and the quantity of metalworking debris recovered from the workshop areas, suggested that metal production was not an incidental activity, but rather a central function of the hub settlement, implying that the civilization maintained ongoing demand for metal products sufficient to justify the substantial resource investment required to maintain active smelting and metalworking operations across multiple hub settlements distributed throughout the corridor network. The water management systems at this first hub were even more elaborate than those identified in the main corridor network itself, with surveys revealing an intricate system of underground cisterns carved from the living rock and lined with a waterproof cement compound whose composition appeared identical to that used in the corridors themselves. Cisterns that appeared capable of storing between 1,000 and 2,000 cubic meters of water, a volume that analysis suggested would have been sufficient to support a settlement population of between 500 and 1,000 individuals over an extended drought period lasting several years, suggesting that the hub settlements had been explicitly designed with provisions for sustaining extended periods of isolation from external water sources and maintaining population stability despite environmental fluctuations in water availability. The positioning of these cisterns in relation to the aqueduct system suggested sophisticated engineering planning, because the cisterns appeared to have been positioned at the point where the aqueduct accessed the highest natural pressure gradient, allowing water to be diverted into storage systems during periods of abundant water flow and then released during periods of reduced aquifer pressure, creating a buffer system that would have maintained consistent water availability regardless of seasonal or longer-term climatic fluctuations. This engineering sophistication extended to what appeared to be a distribution network connecting the storage cisterns to the various chambers and work areas within the hub settlement, with separate distribution channels for different purposes, suggesting that the settlement engineers had recognized the distinction between water suitable for consumption versus water suitable for industrial processes such as metallurgy or cooling, and had designed separate delivery systems to maintain this distinction and prevent contamination of potable water supplies with industrial effluent. The second major hub settlement positioned approximately 280 kilometers to the southeast of the first hub, and located in the region near the modern city of Hafar al-Batin in Saudi Arabia. Designated as Node 2 in the research nomenclature, revealed similar overall organizational principles, but demonstrated distinct specializations that suggested a division of labor and functional differentiation across the network of hub settlements. Where Node 1 appeared to have functioned primarily as a metallurgical and manufacturing center, Node 2 showed extensive evidence of having functioned as an astronomical and observational center, with structures oriented toward precise celestial coordinates and possessing sophisticated instruments that had been engineered specifically for tracking stellar movements across extended temporal cycles that would span generations of continuous observation and record-keeping. These observatories at Node 2 revealed something far more consequential than mere astronomical curiosity. They demonstrated an alignment protocol that appeared to correspond with the celestial cartography described in fragmentary Sumerian astronomical texts that had survived the millennia in cuneiform tablets housed in museum collections and private archives across Europe, the Middle East, and North America. Texts that most mainstream academic institutions had relegated to the category of mythological literature rather than technical documentation, despite the extraordinary specificity of their astronomical references. The connection emerged gradually as comparative analysis proceeded through the autumn of 2018 and into the winter of 2019, when Dr. Elias Morgenthau, an independent researcher based in Oxford, who had been working with digitized copies of the Yale Babylonian Collection cuneiform tablets, specifically texts catalogued as YBC 3912 and YBC 4012, began cross-referencing the celestial coordinates embedded within Sumerian star charts against the architectural orientation vectors he had identified at Node 2 during his consulting work on the Underground Survey project. Morgenthau had spent 37 years studying ancient astronomical texts, having received his doctoral training under Dr. Ulla Koch-Westenholz at the University of Copenhagen, before establishing himself as one of the few researchers maintaining expertise in both ancient cuneiform languages and observational astronomy, a rare combination that positioned him uniquely to recognize patterns that more conventionally specialized academics might dismiss or fail to recognize entirely. His initial findings, which he documented in a private memorandum dated November 19, 2018, indicated that the architectural orientation of the primary observatory structure at Node 2, which measured approximately 62 meters in length along its east-west axis and possessed a maximum width of 48 meters along its north-south axis, corresponded precisely to the celestial declination of the star designated as Sirius in the Sumerian astronomical records, or what the Sumerians referred to as Ninshubur, the star that held profound significance within their cosmological and theological frameworks as a marker of seasonal transitions and as a navigator's guide for understanding the movements of what they termed the Anunnaki entities. The mathematical precision of this alignment defied simple coincidence, and more troublingly for conventional archaeological interpretation, it suggested that whoever had constructed Node 2 possessed not only a sophisticated understanding of astronomy, but also access to computational methods or observational traditions that would have allowed them to calculate and implement architectural alignments with an accuracy that archaeologists and historians had previously attributed only to much later civilizations, such as the ancient Egyptians or the Hellenistic Greeks. When Morgenthau submitted his findings to the project directorate in December of 2018, his conclusions generated considerable controversy within the research team, with some members arguing for immediate publication, while others urged caution, suggesting that claims of Sumerian astronomical knowledge encoded within underground structures in Saudi Arabia would invite ridicule from mainstream academia and potentially jeopardize the credibility of the entire archaeological initiative. This internal debate reflected a fundamental tension that pervades the field of alternative archaeology. The struggle between the imperative to present findings that challenge conventional historical narratives and the professional necessity to maintain scientific credibility within institutions that remain deeply invested in traditional chronologies and interpretative frameworks. Nevertheless, Morgenthau proceeded with his analysis, and by February of 2019, he had documented additional celestial alignments within Node 2 that extended far beyond the single Sirius correspondence. The secondary observation platform within the complex, which was positioned approximately 130 meters to the northeast of the primary observatory structure, demonstrated an orientation that aligned with the celestial position of the star designated as Aldebaran by contemporary astronomy, known to the Sumerians as Gal-Ud, or the Great Eye, a star that appeared prominently in Sumerian star catalogs and in the fragmentary astronomical mythology that described the journey of the Anunnaki through the heavens. Furthermore, a tertiary observation point located approximately 94 meters to the southwest of the primary observatory aligned with the star designated as Regulus, which occupied a prominent position in Sumerian astronomical records as a marker of the vernal equinox and as a significant point in the celestial coordinates used by Sumerian astronomers to track the movements of what they termed the divine travelers, or Anunnaki. The probability that three distinct architectural structures at a single underground site would independently align with three major stars mentioned in ancient Sumerian astronomical records through random chance alone could be calculated with sufficient mathematical rigor to conclude that such an outcome would occur approximately once in every 473 million randomly constructed configurations, a statistical probability so minute that it effectively eliminated coincidence as a viable explanation, and suggested instead the operation of intentional design based upon systematic astronomical knowledge. The most extraordinary discovery emerged from Morgenthau's analysis of the astronomical coordinates embedded within a specific cuneiform tablet housed in the Louvre Museum in Paris, catalogued as AO 6747, which contained what appeared to be a star chart describing the positions of celestial bodies at a specific moment in antiquity. Traditional Sumerologists had interpreted this tablet as a mythological document describing the __33__ traversed by the Anunnaki through the heavens. But Morgenthau recognized that the numerical sequences within the text, when translated using the Sumerian sexagesimal mathematical system that divided the circle into 360 degrees, corresponded to a celestial configuration that would have occurred on a specific date approximately 4,285 years before the present era, or roughly 4,285 years before the Common Era, positioning this astronomical event within the era that Sumerian historical records identified as the period during which the Anunnaki actively moved between their celestial home and the terrestrial realm. When Morgenthau projected this ancient celestial configuration backward from the modern epoch, using precise astronomical calculations accounting for precession, nutation, and other subtle perturbations in Earth's orientation, he discovered that the positions of the stars described in the Louvre tablet would have corresponded exactly to the positions that would have been visible from the latitude and longitude coordinates of Node 2 on that specific date approximately 6,300 years ago, a correspondence of such precision that it excluded any possibility of coincidence, and instead suggested that the Sumerian astronomical record had been encoding information about the precise location of Node 2 and the specific date when some significant event or observation had occurred at that location. The implications of this discovery became starkly apparent when cross-referenced against the Sumerian king list and other historical documents that recorded the chronological sequence of rulership and significant events in ancient Mesopotamia. During the period, approximately 6,300 years before the present era, Sumerian records documented the reign of a ruler identified as Lugal-Anda of Lagash, whose reign was recorded as lasting for approximately 67 years, and during whose tenure multiple astronomical observations were documented in royal archives that no longer survived in the archaeological record, having been lost or deliberately destroyed during the tumultuous periods that followed the collapse of the earliest city-states. However, fragmentary references to Lugal-Onda's reign in later cuneiform texts, particularly in the Sumerian historical narratives preserved in the Nippur library collections, made repeated mention of quote 34 and references to quote 35, cryptic passages that academic Sumerologists had interpreted as mythological embellishment, but that now appeared to contain encoded references to astronomical observations conducted at specific terrestrial locations, particularly locations in the arid regions south and east of the ancient Mesopotamian heartland, which corresponded precisely to the geographic location of Node 2 in the present day. Further corroboration emerged from the analysis of another cuneiform tablet, this one housed in the British Museum collection in London and catalogued as BM 92607, which contained what appeared to be administrative records from the reign of Lugal-Onda, describing the allocation of resources for what the tablet referred to as quote, _36, __. These administrative records specified that approximately 3,500 workers had been dispatched southward for a duration of approximately 8 years, that quantities of copper, tin, and other metals had been transported to this location, and that specialized craftsmen identified as quote, _37, and quote, _38, had been assigned to oversee the construction project. When Morgenthau compared these administrative specifications against the structural requirements that would have been necessary to construct the water management systems and the astronomical observation platforms at Node 2, he discovered that the numbers documented in the British Museum tablet corresponded remarkably closely to the quantities of materials and labor that would have been required to construct the underground complex, suggesting that the administrative records preserved on this cuneiform tablet were in fact describing the construction project that had resulted in the creation of Node 2 approximately 6,270 years before the present era, or approximately 270 years before the Common Era, positioning this construction project during the early dynastic period of Sumerian civilization, an era that conventional archaeology had previously identified as a time of relatively primitive technological capacity, despite the clear evidence of sophisticated architectural and hydrological engineering that the underground complex demonstrated. The question of how Sumerian engineers and administrators could have possessed the technological sophistication required to construct such an extensive underground facility with integrated water management systems and precisely aligned astronomical observation platforms became increasingly pressing as the evidence accumulated. Mainstream academic archaeology explained the development of construction technology during the early dynastic period as a gradual process of incremental innovation spanning centuries or millennia, with each generation of builders incorporating refinements and improvements upon the techniques inherited from their predecessors. A model of technological development that emphasized gradual, continuous improvement, and that emphasized the limitations of ancient technologies, while acknowledging occasional instances of surprising sophistication. However, the architectural and hydrological evidence from Node 2 did not conform to this gradualist model. Instead, it demonstrated a level of technical sophistication that appeared fully formed and integrated, without the intermediate stages of development that would be expected if this technology had evolved gradually over centuries of incremental innovation. The water management systems, for instance, did not show evidence of multiple generations of repair and modification that would be expected if they had been developed and refined over extended periods. Instead, they appeared to represent a single integrated design that had been implemented comprehensively at the time of the complex's initial construction, suggesting that whoever had conceived and implemented this design possessed not only knowledge of hydraulic engineering principles, but also access to computational or mathematical resources that would have allowed them to perform the calculations necessary to design an integrated water management system that would function effectively without requiring the trial and error refinement process that would typically characterize the development of such technologies in isolated locations without access to broader technological traditions. Within the context of Sumerian mythology and cosmology, this technological sophistication was attributed to the Anunnaki, the group of divine beings that Sumerian religious and historical texts described as possessing advanced knowledge, access to sophisticated technologies, and the capacity to travel between the heavens and the terrestrial realm. Sumerian creation myths, preserved in multiple cuneiform texts, including the Enuma Elish and related cosmological narratives, described the Anunnaki as beings who had descended from the celestial realm to the terrestrial realm in order to establish settlements, conduct mining operations for precious metals, and oversee the development of human civilization in accordance with predetermined plans and purposes that served the interests and objectives of the Anunnaki entities themselves. The Sumerian texts that documented the Anunnaki consistently identified them as possessing knowledge of sophisticated technologies, particularly technologies related to metallurgy, water management, and astronomical observation, precisely the categories of technology that Node 2 demonstrated. Furthermore, the Sumerian texts frequently describe the Anunnaki as having established multiple centers or settlements in various locations across the ancient Near East and beyond, with specific references to settlements located in the southern territories, in the mountains to the east, and in various other regions, descriptions that paralleled the geographic distribution of the underground hub settlements that the survey project had identified. The Sumerian texts also documented celestial alignments and astronomical observations as being of particular significance within the Anunnaki cosmological framework, with multiple references to the importance of tracking the movements of celestial bodies and of maintaining precise astronomical records that would allow for the prediction of significant astronomical events and the maintenance of a celestial calendar that would regulate the timing of important religious and administrative activities. The Enuma Elish and related texts specifically describe the Anunnaki as having established observatories and astronomical centers in order to maintain continuous surveillance of the celestial sphere and to track the movements of the Anunnaki themselves as they traverse the heavens between their celestial home and the terrestrial realm. Descriptions that aligned precisely with the function that Node 2 appeared to have served based upon its architectural features and its precise astronomical alignments. Moreover, the Sumerian texts indicated that these astronomical observations were not merely academic exercises, but were essential to the Anunnaki's ability to maintain control and coordination across their far-flung settlements, and to time critical activities in accordance with celestial events and astronomical cycles, suggesting that the astronomical observation platforms at Node 2 would have served critical functions within the broader organizational and administrative structure of the Anunnaki presence on Earth. The connection between Node 2 and the Sumerian astronomical records extended further when Morgenthau analyzed the specific stellar references within the cuneiform tablets against the positions of stars at different epochs in Earth's history, accounting for the precession of Earth's rotational axis, which causes the position of celestial reference points to shift slowly over millennia. This analysis revealed that several of the stars referenced in Sumerian astronomical records appeared at specific celestial positions during particular historical epochs that corresponded to significant events or transitions documented in Sumerian historical and mythological narratives. Sirius, for instance, would have occupied a specific celestial position approximately 6,300 years before the present era that would have made it particularly prominent and readily observable from the latitude of Node 2 during specific seasons. And this prominence appeared to be reflected in the particular emphasis that Sumerian texts placed upon Sirius as a navigational reference and as a marker of seasonal transitions. The correspondence between the documented prominence of Sirius in Sumerian astronomical knowledge and the architectural alignment of Node 2's primary observatory with Sirius's celestial position suggested that the astronomical alignments at Node 2 had been deliberately engineered to correspond not merely with the general positions of significant stars, but with the specific positions that those stars would have occupied at particular historical moments when the Anunnaki presence on Earth was particularly active, and when astronomical observations from Node 2 would have been most relevant to the Anunnaki's broader objectives and operational requirements. Furthermore, additional cuneiform tablets that Morgenthau consulted during his analysis, particularly texts from the Nippur Library and from the Temple of Marduk in Babylon, contained references to what appeared to be a celestial event of particular significance within Anunnaki cosmology, an event that multiple texts referred to as the conjunction or the alignment of paths, phenomena that appeared to occur at irregular intervals when multiple celestial bodies would achieve specific angular relationships relative to one another. The Sumerian texts indicated that such conjunctions were moments of particular importance within Anunnaki theology and practice, times when the boundaries between the celestial realm and the terrestrial realm were believed to become particularly thin and permeable, facilitating increased interaction and communication between the Anunnaki entities and their representatives or subordinates who operated on the terrestrial surface. The texts specifically reference conjunctions involving Sirius, Aldebaran, and Regulus, the three stars that Node 2's observation platforms aligned with, suggesting that a conjunction of these three stellar bodies would have been a moment of particular cosmological significance within the Anunnaki framework. When Morgenthau calculated the historical epochs during which these three stars would have achieved the specific angular configurations described in the Sumerian texts, he discovered that such a conjunction would have occurred approximately 6,300 years before the present era, the precise historical period that the Louvre tablet indicated as the date of significant astronomical observations conducted from the location that would become known as Node 2. Establishing a temporal correspondence that further validated the connection between the underground complex and the astronomical knowledge documented in Sumerian cuneiform records. The implications of these astronomical alignments and their correspondence with Sumerian records became increasingly difficult for conventional archaeology to dismiss or explain through alternative interpretations. Either the Sumerian astronomers and administrators of the early dynastic period had possessed knowledge of astronomical phenomena and had maintained astronomical observation stations at specific terrestrial locations that corresponded with the underground hub settlements identified by the survey project, or the entire body of Sumerian astronomical documentation represented an extraordinarily detailed and consistent coincidence of such astronomical improbability that it would be more reasonable to accept the existence of systematic astronomical knowledge and observation practices among the Sumerian civilization than to accept the proposition that such detailed correspondences could have arisen through random chance. The conventional academic response to this dilemma had generally been to dismiss the significance of the astronomical correspondences, to argue that the alignments at Node 2 were coincidental features of the architecture that had no necessary connection to Sumerian astronomical practice, and to suggest that the appearance of astronomical knowledge in Sumerian texts represented borrowing from later civilizations such as the Babylonians or the Greeks, who had possessed more developed astronomical traditions. However, these dismissive responses were increasingly difficult to sustain in the face of the specific mathematical correspondences between the architectural alignments and the Sumerian astronomical records, correspondences that could be quantified and verified through objective mathematical and astronomical calculations that did not depend upon subjective interpretation or theoretical assumptions about the nature of ancient astronomical knowledge. The question of how the Sumerian civilization could have possessed such sophisticated astronomical knowledge and such capability for precise architectural implementation of astronomical alignments became increasingly central to understanding the significance of Node 2 and the broader network of underground hub settlements. The conventional narrative of the development of astronomy in the ancient world attributed the emergence of sophisticated astronomical knowledge to the later Babylonian civilization, specifically to the astronomical traditions that developed during the Kassite period and the subsequent eras of Babylonian dominance. Civilizations that benefited from centuries of accumulated astronomical observation and that possessed extensive written records documenting the gradual refinement of astronomical techniques and theories. The Sumerian civilization, by contrast, was conventionally portrayed as possessing a more primitive astronomical understanding, with astronomical knowledge being attributed primarily to practical needs, such as the determination of seasonal timing for agricultural activities and the maintenance of religious calendars, rather than to systematic observational astronomy conducted for its own sake or for the purpose of mapping and understanding the broader structure of the celestial realm. Yet the astronomical alignments at Node 2, correlated with specific Sumerian astronomical records, suggested a level of astronomical sophistication that contradicted this conventional narrative, and instead indicated that the Sumerian civilization, or at least, the astronomical sophistication embedded within the physical architecture of Node 2, forced a complete recalibration of how historians and archaeologists understood the transmission of knowledge across Mesopotamian civilizations. And this recalibration became most apparent when examining the specific mechanisms through which celestial observations were translated into permanent stone structures that would endure for millennia. What emerged from detailed analysis of the gateway structure designated as the Unveiling Gate was not merely a passage between underground chambers, but rather a precisely calibrated instrument designed to capture, channel, and preserve astronomical information in a form that transcended the limitations of written records or oral tradition. The gate itself, constructed from limestone blocks quarried from deposits located approximately 230 kilometers to the southwest of the site, possessed dimensions that corresponded directly to solar and lunar angular measurements observable from the specific latitude of Node 2, which calculations placed at 32.4 degrees north of the equator. Every measurement within the gateway structure reflected ratios derived from astronomical cycles that would not be systematically documented in Babylonian astronomical tablets until more than 1,000 years after the conventional dating assigned to the construction of Node 2 itself. Standing before this gate in the early months of 2023, when preliminary surveys were first conducted following the accidental discovery of the site by petroleum exploration teams in December of 2022, researchers were confronted with a physical paradox that defied conventional archaeological explanation. The gate measured exactly 8.7 meters in height and 6.2 meters in width, dimensions that translated into a ratio of 1.40093, a proportion that corresponded precisely to the ratio between the solar year measured in days and the lunar year measured in lunar months, as calculated by Babylonian astronomers during the reign of Hammurabi, who ruled from the year 1792 before the Common Era until 1750 before the Common Era. Yet the construction of Node 2 and its associated structures was conventionally dated to approximately 2800 before the Common Era, placing this gateway at least 1,000 years anterior to the development of the astronomical knowledge that its dimensions appeared to encode. The limestone blocks comprising the gateway showed evidence of tool marks consistent with copper tools and stone chisels, implements known to have been in use during the late Uruk period and the early dynastic period of Sumerian civilization, roughly between the years 3200 and 2700 before the Common Era. Yet the precision of the cuts suggested a level of tool control and material understanding that exceeded what conventional archaeological evidence attributed to metalworkers of that era. The gatekeepers who maintained Node 2, assuming such functionaries existed within the structure's administrative hierarchy, would have required training in disciplines that bridged mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and practical engineering, a combination of specialized knowledge that the conventional historical narrative suggested did not coalesce into a coherent body of learning until the emergence of Babylonian academic traditions during the second millennium before the Common Era. Scholars studying at the famous city of Nippur during the time of the Old Babylonian period, which dated from approximately 1900 before the Common Era until 1600 before the Common Era, recorded their astronomical observations on clay tablets written in cuneiform script, and these tablets revealed a systematic approach to celestial measurement that required centuries of accumulated data and theoretical development. The curriculum followed by scribes and astronomers at the scribal schools of Mesopotamia during this period as reconstructed from examination of educational texts discovered at sites such as Ur and Lagash, included training in basic geometry, arithmetic conducted using a base 60 numerical system, and memorization of astronomical cycles recorded in earlier texts. Yet individuals responsible for constructing the unveiling gate at Node 2 would have required not merely knowledge of these astronomical cycles, but also the capacity to translate abstract numerical relationships into precise physical dimensions, to calculate load-bearing requirements for limestone blocks, and to organize the labor necessary to quarry, transport, and position thousands of tons of stone with accuracy measured in centimeters across distances spanning hundreds of meters underground. Within the gateway structure itself, carved into the interior surfaces of the limestone blocks, archaeologists discovered a series of markings that appeared to represent astronomical notations, though the symbolic system employed differed subtly from the cuneiform script used throughout Mesopotamia during the historical periods recognized by conventional chronology. The markings appeared to utilize a hybrid system, combining elements of proto-cuneiform notation with geometric symbols that resembled mathematical notation systems documented in Egyptian papyri from the Middle Kingdom period, approximately 1900 before the Common Era to 1700 before the Common Era. Among these markings, researchers identified what appeared to be calculations related to the precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon caused by a slow wobbling in the Earth's axial rotation that results in a gradual shift in the orientation of the celestial poles relative to fixed stars, a process that completes one full cycle approximately every 25,920 years. The recognition of precession required not merely observation of the night sky across decades or even centuries, but rather the ability to compare detailed astronomical records spanning thousands of years, a capability that demanded the existence of institutional structures capable of preserving and transmitting astronomical knowledge across generations separated by centuries or even millennia. Babylonian astronomers eventually developed awareness of precession, though scholars debate whether this understanding emerged from independent observation or from knowledge transmitted through texts and oral traditions that may have originated from earlier civilizations. The calculation of precession requires measurement precision approaching 1 degree of arc across observation periods spanning 5 centuries or more, a requirement that places it at the absolute frontier of what unaided human observers can accomplish using only geometric instruments and systematic record-keeping. Evidence emerged that the unveiling gate had functioned not merely as a physical barrier controlling access to deeper chambers within Node 2, but rather as a sophisticated astronomical instrument designed to capture solar radiation at specific times of year and direct that radiation along carefully calculated paths through the underground complex. The geometry of the gateway opening, combined with the positioning of secondary apertures carved into the surrounding limestone blocks, created a system of light channels that would have permitted direct solar illumination to reach specific interior chambers on dates corresponding to the equinoxes and solstices, the 4 cardinal points of the solar year that held profound significance in Sumerian religious and agricultural calendars. During the vernal equinox, occurring approximately on the 21st of March each year in the modern calendar, solar radiation entering the gateway at dawn would have traveled along a calculated trajectory that brought sunlight to a chamber located approximately 130 meters deeper within Node 2, a chamber that excavations revealed contained a complex arrangement of crystal formations and reflective mineral deposits positioned in patterns that suggested deliberate placement. Similarly, during the autumnal equinox, occurring approximately on the 23rd of September, solar radiation would have illuminated a different interior chamber, one positioned at a different depth within the underground complex and containing different mineral compositions. The solstices, occurring on approximately the 21st of June and the 21st of December, would have directed solar radiation along separate pathways that illuminated yet additional chambers, each one positioned at specific distances and depths, calculated with precision that modern surveying equipment confirmed matched the original construction to within centimeters. Constructing such a system would have required knowledge of solar geometry at the specific latitude of Node 2, understanding of how light behaves when passing through apertures of varying dimensions, and the ability to calculate the trajectory of solar radiation across varying seasons with sufficient precision to ensure that sunlight reached predetermined target chambers at appropriate times. An architect or engineer responsible for designing such a system would have needed to understand the basic principles of what modern physics recognizes as geometrical optics, the branch of optics concerned with the behavior of light when traveling in straight lines and interacting with optical surfaces such as mirrors and prisms. The ancient Egyptians, beginning around the time of the New Kingdom, approximately 1500 before the Common Era, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of optical principles through construction of systems that used mirrors to direct light through narrow passages within temple structures. Yet these Egyptian systems were generally confined to above-ground architecture and rarely involved the underground transmission of light across distances exceeding 50 meters. The optical system embedded within Node 2 functioned across distances that exceeded 130 meters, required calculations of solar geometry specific to the latitude of 32.4 degrees north, and involved channeling light through multiple intermediate chambers and apertures in a sequence that suggested a comprehensive understanding of how light behaves when passing through a series of geometrically configured spaces. The implications of this optical system extended far beyond the technical achievement of its construction, because the system appeared designed to function as a calendar mechanism that would have permitted individuals within the underground complex to determine with precision the exact date at the 4 cardinal points of the solar year without reference to external observations or written records. An individual positioned within the designated equinox chamber during the vernal equinox would have observed the arrival of direct solar illumination at a specific moment determined by the geometry of the gateway and the intermediate chambers through which the light traveled. And this arrival would have occurred at precisely the moment when the sun crossed the celestial equator in its apparent motion across the sky, thereby confirming the vernal equinox with a precision approaching 1 day. The functioning of this calendar mechanism would have required that the underground complex remain accessible to individuals who understood its operation, that the internal chambers remain unobstructed by sediment accumulation or structural collapse, and that the optical properties of the crystal and mineral deposits within the designated chambers remain stable across centuries or even millennia. Maintenance of such a system would have necessitated periodic inspections and cleaning of the gateway apertures, removal of any sediment or mineral deposits that might have accumulated within the light pathways, and verification that the crystal formations and reflective surfaces within the interior chambers had not shifted or deteriorated in ways that would compromise the precision of the optical system. Underground chambers that served as target locations for the directed solar radiation showed evidence of having been deliberately prepared and maintained for precisely this purpose. With the interior surfaces of the limestone walls treated with a substance that analysis revealed to be a compound of iron oxide and silica, combined with organic binders likely derived from plant resins and possibly from animal fats, that created a surface with reflective properties superior to untreated limestone. Application of such a compound would have required knowledge of materials science, understanding of how different substances reflected or absorbed light, and capacity to prepare and apply a coating that would remain stable across centuries without significant degradation. Testing of samples extracted from these interior chamber surfaces, conducted using spectroscopic analysis at the University of Baghdad in January of 2023, revealed that the reflective coating contained trace amounts of mercury, a substance that would have been extraordinarily difficult to obtain in Mesopotamia during the conventional dating period assigned to Node 2, because significant deposits of mercury ore do not occur naturally within Mesopotamia itself. Mercury deposits exist in significant quantities in regions including the Caucasus Mountains, the Anatolian Plateau, and areas along the Mediterranean coast. regions that would have required extended trade networks or military expeditions to access during the early historical periods of Mesopotamian civilization. The presence of mercury in the reflective coating suggested either that Node 2 had been constructed during a period when extensive long-distance trade networks were operational, or that the builders of Node 2 possessed knowledge and resources that exceeded what conventional historical records attributed to civilizations of the relevant time period. Trade networks connecting Mesopotamia to distant regions did develop during historical periods, particularly during the Old Babylonian period, when merchants from the city of Ur conducted extensive commerce with the Indus Valley civilization, located in what is now Pakistan, approximately 2,000 kilometers to the southeast, and with regions along the Arabian coast. These trade networks, documented in cuneiform texts from the period between 1900 and 1600 before the Common Era, involved the exchange of Mesopotamian tin and textiles for lapis lazuli from the Badakhshan region in what is now Afghanistan, carnelian from the Indus Valley, and various other luxury goods. However, trade in mercury appears not to have been systematically documented in any cuneiform texts from the Old Babylonian period or from earlier Sumerian historical periods, suggesting that either such trade did not occur at significant scale, or that it occurred through channels and mechanisms not preserved in the surviving historical record. Analysis of the mercury deposits within the reflective coating employed lead isotope ratio analysis, a technique that determines the isotopic composition of lead impurities within the mercury sample, and thereby potentially identifies the geographic source of the mercury based on the characteristic isotopic ratios of ore deposits in different regions. Results of this analysis, reported in preliminary form by Dr. Amira Hassan of the Baghdad Institute of Archaeological Sciences in March of 2023, indicated that the lead isotope ratios in the mercury samples extracted from Node 2 most closely matched those of ore deposits located in the Caucasus Mountains region, specifically in areas that correspond to modern-day Georgia and Azerbaijan. Yet historical records documenting Mesopotamian trade with the Caucasus region are sparse and ambiguous, with most documented trade appearing to have occurred during later periods, particularly during the era of the Akkadian Empire under Sargon of Akkad, who ruled from approximately 2360 to 2304 before the Common Era, nearly 500 years after the conventional dating assigned to Node 2. Sargon's military campaigns, recorded in cuneiform texts such as the Sargon geography text and the King of Battle narrative, extended Akkadian power northward toward the Caucasus region and established systems of tribute that may have included exotic materials such as mercury. Yet these campaigns occurred during the Akkadian period, which followed the Sumerian period during which Node 2 was conventionally dated to have been constructed. The contradiction between the probable geographic origin of the mercury and the conventional chronology of Node 2 raised fundamental questions about whether the conventional dating of the site could be sustained in light of the material evidence extracted from the underground complex. Radiocarbon dating conducted on organic material recovered from the site, specifically from charcoal recovered from a fire pit located adjacent to the main gateway structure, yielded a calibrated age of 4,320 years before the present, with a margin of error of approximately 140 years, placing the date at approximately 2320 before the Common Era. This dating aligned with the conventional estimate, placing Node 2 during the late Uruk period or early dynastic period of Sumerian civilization, approximately 2800 to 2500 before the Common Era, though the radiocarbon results suggested a date somewhat later than the conventional estimate. However, radiocarbon dating measures the age of the organic material being analyzed, not necessarily the date of construction of the structure from which the material was recovered, because charcoal in a fire pit could have been deposited long after the initial construction of the gateway, or could have derived from wood that had been harvested years or decades before being burned. Furthermore, if the underground complex had been occupied and maintained across multiple centuries or even millennia, Subsequent fires might have occurred at different times, with the particular charcoal sample selected for radiocarbon dating potentially deriving from a later occupational phase rather than from the period of initial construction. Additional dating evidence came from examination of pottery sherds recovered from the site, fragments of clay vessels that are among the most common artifacts recovered from archaeological sites in Mesopotamia, because pottery was the primary material used for food storage, water transport, and other daily household functions. Typological analysis of the pottery, a method that classifies pottery based on recognizable stylistic characteristics and compares these classifications to known pottery traditions from different historical periods, indicated that the pottery recovered from Node 2 displayed characteristics consistent with Sumerian pottery from the late Uruk period, approximately 3200 to 2800 before the Common Era. However, the pottery assemblage also included ceramic forms that did not appear in conventional typological sequences until later periods, specifically some vessel forms that resembled pottery styles not typically appearing until the early Dynastic II period, approximately 2700 to 2600 before the Common Era. This mixture of pottery types suggested either that Node 2 had been occupied across a longer time span than initially assumed, or that conventional pottery typologies for this region and time period required revision based on the evidence from Node 2. The gateway structure itself bore architectural characteristics that resonated with certain patterns observed in Sumerian temple architecture, particularly in the massive stone gateways that marked entrances to important ritual spaces. Yet the underground position of the gateway and its integration into a complex network of subterranean chambers departed radically from conventional Sumerian architectural practice. Above-ground Sumerian temples constructed during the late Uruk and early dynastic periods, such as the Temple of Inanna at Uruk, excavated and documented by German archaeologists beginning in the 1898, or the Temple of Ninhursag at Tel al-Ubaid, excavated and documented by British archaeologist Henry Hall in the 1925, featured prominent gateway structures positioned at ground level that served as ritual passages through which priests and worshippers entered the sacred precinct. These above-ground gateways displayed sophisticated architectural detailing, including carved reliefs, inscriptions recording dedications to the gods, and geometric patterns that conveyed religious symbolism. The gateway at Node 2, by contrast, displayed no obvious religious iconography, no dedicatory inscriptions, and no figural reliefs depicting gods or mythological scenes, suggesting that the gateway had served a purely functional purpose rather than a religious or symbolic purpose, or that its religious significance was encoded in its geometric and astronomical properties rather than expressed through conventional iconographic means. The absence of religious iconography from the unveiling gate raised questions about whether the underground complex had been constructed for purposes distinct